This is chapter 9 of Laura Hillenbrand's book Unbroken, titled 594 Holes. It's a lot of holes. In February 1943, during a brief visit to the equatorial island of Canton, the Superman crew, we're pretty close to the equator, right? I'm pretty close to the equator right here on Hawaii. So this is pretty close to where this is. The Superman crew had its first encounter with exploding sharks. Interesting way to start a chapter. Canton was a seething purgatory in the shape of a pork chop, consisting mostly of coral and scrubby plants huddled close to the ground, as if cringing from the heat. There was only one tree on the entire island. The surrounding waters were tumbling with sharks, which got trapped in the lagoon at low tide. Bored out of their wits, the local servicemen would tie garbage to long sticks and dangle them over the lagoon. When the sharks snapped at the bait, the men would lob hand grenades into their mouths and watch them blow up. I'm sure Pito isn't happy about that. The Superman crew had been sent to Canton for 2 missions over Japanese-occupied Macon and Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. On the first mission, the lead plane made a wrong turn and the men found themselves over Howland, the island that Amelia Earhart had been aiming for when she vanished 6 years earlier. They noticed gouges in the Howland runway, the calling cards of the Japanese. Once they got sorted out and found Macon, Louis couldn't see the target through the clouds. They made 3 circles with no luck, so their colonel ordered them to drop the bombs anywhere and get going. Through a gap in the clouds, Louis spotted a row of outhouses and, with giggling glee, walloped them with 3,000 pounds of demolition bombs. To a cheer from the crew, the outhouses blew sky high. 2 days later, the men flew back to Gilbert's to photograph the islands, bringing a 6-man camera crew. The buzzed several islands under fire, snapping photos. With Superman's nose bloody from an anti-aircraft round, they turned back for Canton. 300 miles from home, Engineer Douglas made a discovery. Superman's eccentric fuel gauges, which had been jiggling around, had settled very low. Douglas announced that at the current rate, they wouldn't make Canton. Phil slowed the propellers as far as he dared and leaned the fuel mixture so that the least possible fuel was used. The crew shoved almost everything that wasn't bolted down, and all 15 men crowded into the front of the plane in the belief that it would improve airspeed. Knowing that their chances of making Canton were slim, they considered Howland, but then they recalled the pitted runway. They discussed ditching near Howland, but that raised the issue of sharks. In the end, they agreed to try for Canton. Wedged together in the front of the plane, all the men could do was wait. The sun set, Louis stared into the dark below and thought about what it would be like to crash. The fuel gauges inched lower, and everyone waited to hear the engine sputtering out. At last, with the fuel gauges at absolute bottom, Phil spotted a searchlight craning around the sky and runway lights dotting the dark below. Realizing that he was too high, Phil dropped the plane so sharply that Pillsbury bobbed into the air and hung there a moment, weightless, before slamming down. As Superman touched down on Canton, its tail settled lower than it had been in the air, causing the last drops of fuel to shift back. A moment later, one engine quit. 2 weeks later, the men saw what would have awaited them as they'd gone down at sea. A B-25 flying off Oahu, that's where I'm at right now, radioed that it was low on fuel, then went silent. Superman was scrambled to hunt for it. After an hour and a half of searching, Louis spotted a curl of gray smoke. 2 Catalina flying boats were heading toward it. Superman followed. When they arrived at the crash site, the men were astonished by what they saw. 2 life rafts holding the entire 5-man B-25 crew floated amid plane debris. Around them, the ocean was churning with hundreds of sharks, some of which looked 20 feet long. Knifing agitated circles in the water, the creatures seemed on the verge of overturning the rafts. I've seen sharks here in Hawaii. If you look at the ocean long enough, you'll see a shark. They zigzag. They're like, all aggressive. The Catalinas reached the sailboats, reached the men before the sharks could, and the B-25 men treated their rescuers to drinks that night. But the Superman crew was now understood the feelings of the grenade throwers on Canton. On a later flight, when they saw several sharks harassing 6 whales, they dove low over the water and shot at the sharks. Later, they felt guilty. On future flights, when they saw sharks, they let them be. Nauru was a little afterthought of land, 8 square miles of sand sitting alone in the Pacific, about 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. It was the kind of place that the world might have left alone were it not for the 50,000 tons of high-grade phosphate that lay under the feet of the grass-skirted natives. A central ingredient in fertilizer and munitions, the phosphate had been discovered in 1900, and since the island had been home to a community of European businessmen and Chinese workers who mined the land, when the war began, Nauru became a priceless prize. Because they were after the phosphate in the ground. Japan seized Nauru in August 1942, imprisoning the Europeans who had not fled and forcing the natives and the Chinese to mine phosphate and build a runway. They enforced their authority with the sword, beheading people for infractions as trivial as the theft of a pumpkin. When the runway was complete, Japan had a rich source of phosphate and an ideal base for airstrikes. On April 17th, upon returning from a run, Louis was called to a briefing. America was going after Nauru in a big way, sending Superman and 22 other B-24s to hit the phosphate works. No one in the squadron saw a bed that night. They left just before midnight, refueled at Canton, and flew into Funafuti, a tiny atoll from which they would launch their attack. They found it jostling with journalists brought in by the military to cover the raid. At a briefing, the crews were told to approach Nauru at 8,000 feet. The altitude gave Louis and the other pause. That week, they had made practice runs from 8 to 10,000 feet, and the potential for anti-aircraft fire to butcher them at that altitude had alarmed the whole crew. "We only hope," Louis had written in his diary 2 days earlier, "we don't bomb that low in actual combat." Pillsbury couldn't stop thinking about something else that the briefing officer had said. There would be 10 to 12 Zeros waiting for them. He'd seen a distant Zero at wake, but had never been engaged by one. The idea of a single Zero was daunting. The prospect of 12 scared him to death. Zeros were the Japanese planes that were really precise. Before dawn the next day, the men walked together to Superman. With them was a lieutenant named Donald Nelson. He wasn't on the crew, but asked if he could tag along so he could see combat. At 5 a.m., Superman was airborne. I don't think this Donald Nelson guy had picked the right plane to get on. Dog-legging in the west to hide their point of origin, the planes took 6.5 hours to reach Nauru. No one spoke. Superman led the massive bombers, flying with a plane on each wing. The sun rose and the planes flew into a clear morning. The Japanese would see them coming. At about 20 past 11, Navigator Mitchell broke the silence. There'd be over the island in 15 minutes. In the greenhouse, Louis could just make out an apostrophe of land. Flat to the horizon below, there was a black shadow in the water. It was an American submarine ready to pick up survivors if bombers were shot down. Superman passed over it and slid over Nauru. Louis shivered. It was eerie silent. The first 9 planes, Superman out front, crossed the island unopposed. The air was very still, and the plane glided along without a ripple. Phil relinquished control to the northern bomb site. Superman's first target, a knot of planes and structures beside a runway, came into view. Louis lined up on the gleaming backs of the plane. And then, shattering, the sky became a fury of color, sound, and motion. Flak hissed up, trailing streamers of smoke over the plains, then burst into black puffs, sparkling with shrapnel. Metal flew everywhere, streaking up from below and raining down from above. With the bomb sight in control, Phil could do nothing. Something struck the bomber on Superman's left wing. Piloted by Lieutenant John Jacobs, the plane sank as if it were drowning. At almost the same moment, the plane to Superman's right was hit. Just a few feet away, Pillsbury watched the bomber falter, drop, and disappear under Superman's wing. Pillsbury could see the men inside, and his mind briefly registered that all of them were about to die. Superman was alone. Wow. They could see the men in the other plane going down like, we're crashing. Louis kept his focus below, trying to aim for the parked planes. As he worked, there was a tremendous bang and a terrific shudder. Much of Superman's right rudder, a chunk the size of a dinner table, blew off. Louis lost the target. As he tried to find it again, a shell bit a wide hole in the bomb bay and the plane rocked again. At last, Louis had his aim, and the first bombs dropped, spun down, and struck their targets. Then, Superman passed over a set of red roof barracks and an anti-aircraft battery. Louis' second and third targets. Louis lined up and watched the bombs crunch into the buildings and battery. He had one bomb left for a target of opportunity. North of the airfield, he saw a shack and took aim. The bomb fell clear, and Louis yelled, "Bombs away!" and turned the valve to close the bomb bay doors. In the cockpit, the bomb release light flicked on, and Phil took control of the plane. As he did, behind and below the plane, there was a pulse of white light and an orb of fire. Louis had made a lucky guess and a perfect drop. The shack was a fuel depot and had struck it dead center in the top turret. Pillsbury pivoted backwards and watched a vast cloud of smoke billow upward. Nice hit, Louis. There was no time for celebration. Zeros were suddenly all around. Louis counted 9 of them slashing around the bombers, machine guns blazing. The boldness and skill of the Japanese pilots astounded the bomber crews. The Zeros flew at the bombers head-on, cannons firing, slicing between planes that were just feet apart. They passed so close that Louis could see the faces of the pilots. Firing furiously, the bomber gunners tried to take out the Zeros. The shooting was all point blank and bullets were flying everywhere. One bomber sustained 17 hits from friendly planes or possibly from his own waist guns. Stricken bombers began slipping behind and the Zeros pounced. One bomber was hounded by 4 Zeros in a biplane. Its gunners shot down 1 Zero before their pilot found a cloud to hide in, scattering his pursuers. Below, Lieutenant Jacobs, Phil's lost wingman, was still airborne, his plane laboring along the 3 engines and no right rudder in the circle of Zeros. His gunners sent 1 Zero down. Thor Hamrin, pilot of the B-24, jab in the ass, saw Jacobs struggling. Circling back and speeding down, he opened up on the Zeros with all of his guns. The Zeros backed off and Jacobs flew on with a Hamrin on his wing. The first bombers, pursued by Zeros, headed out to sea. With its fighters gone and many of its guns deployed, the Japanese base was left exposed. The trailing B-24 swept in, crossed the rivers of smoke to rain bombs on the phosphate plant. In the last plane over the island, a reporter raised his binoculars. He saw a volcano-like mass of smoke and fire. A burning Japanese bomber, a few bursts of anti-aircraft fire, and not a single moving person. Okay. That was part 1 of Laura Hillenbrand's book. That was part 1 of chapter 9 in Laura Hillenbrand's book.